Hi guys. So my name is Charlie. I am from New Jersey. But before that, make sure that you follow Fiveable on all your socials, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube. Make sure to do that ASAP before I actually start streaming. That'd be really great for all of us. So in the stream, we're going to be going over, as I said before, World War I, World War II, causes, why the US entered, and then the effects. And it's just going to be really chill. It's just like just new information, but also a review of stuff that you may have learned in like earlier world history. So it's really nothing to be scared of, because honestly, if you study the content and you really put like effort into the class and you don't procrastinate, you take notes, you watch Fiveable, of course, you are really set to get whatever grade you really want, you hope for. I definitely think that way. I was so scared going into this because I was a freshman. It was I took 2 APs my freshman year, which probably wasn't the best idea. But AP World, I was like, oh no, because I had a track meet the day before the AP World test, so I was out until 10. And I was like, oh no, I'm not gonna be able to study. I'm not gonna know anything. And honestly, it was just like a nice review through the book, just some Fiveable before I was even a part of Fiveable, and it really just helped me prepare for this. So it's definitely not something to be too scared of. Honestly, the day of the test, you just feel so relieved, like, wow, all the stress is over. So the introduction I started with at the beginning. Sorry, my name is Charlie. I am a student streamer for Fiveable. I do content creation and streaming for AP World History. And I also do content creation for AP Music Theory, because that's the other AP I took my freshman year. I'm a sophomore now. As I said before, like 3 times, I took AP World as a freshman, and I got a 5, which makes me sound like I'm some type of robot. But I am not a robot. I really studied the information. I read through it, and I think I studied the guidelines, like the grading of the test, and I think that's what helped me get that score. And I kind of devoted myself to AP World. I wasn't like obsessive over it, but I definitely studied a little, and I reviewed all the stuff I knew already. So if you put your mind to it, it's and you put dedication towards it, you can get whatever grade you want in the AP exam. It's just a matter of your willingness to put the effort towards what you want. So enough rambling. So World War I. Oh, before I get into this, feel free to ask any questions you want in the comments, or there's an ask a question button on the very bottom. Feel free to ask whatever you want. I will pause and I will answer all of your questions as I go on. So don't be shy with those. So as I said before, World War I, it's from 1914 to 1918. So we're just getting into the 1900s. So this was against the Allied powers and the Central Powers. So if you studied if you studied World War II at some point, you would have heard the Allies, but we don't really hear the Central Powers, because in World War II, we call those the Axis. The Central Powers are, for the majority, the same nations. We have another nation that's part of the Central Powers that isn't really as involved in World War II, and it's Austria-Hungary. So it's one of the major Central Powers that we'll be going over today. Like World War II, it's a really international war. It's not like with other wars where it only happens in one area. Like the American Revolution was pretty much only in the United States. We have the Crimean War, which is pretty much only in present-day Ukraine. This war pretty much happens on every continent, and that's something we're going to be discussing today. How World War I happened in Europe and Asia and the United States, and it's one of the first examples of a truly international war. So there's a lot of causes for World War I that we're going to explain in later slides, and there's a really fun acronym to remember all of these, because I cannot remember things without acronyms. So acronyms are just really a great device when you are during the AP exam, just so you can remember things. Yeah, you're on the right track with MAIN. I learned MANIA, which is the one I'm going to be teaching you. But MAIN also works. It's the same exact letters except for one less A. So pretty much the same exact content. So the causes, this is when we're going to be doing the nice little mnemonic device. It's the word MANIA. So MANIA stands for militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the long one, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So militarism is exactly what it sounds like. It's the creation of militaries, military power. Nations are starting to strengthen their militaries for the first time. We're using mustard gas. The Germans are using U-boats for the first time. We're developing strong militaries for the first time that are dependent on things other than guns and physical force. So that's what militarism is. Alliances are these sort of friendships between nations. So essentially how World War I started, it all starts with Serbia, which doesn't seem like a nation we talk about a lot in history, but Serbia is pretty much at the center of World War I. So this is kind of connects with the other A, but a Yugoslav nationalist, Yugoslavia at the time, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, assassinated them, and they were heir to the throne in Austria-Hungary. It was, I believe, a Bosnian man, but he was for the Serbian cause, or a Serbian man but killed them in Bosnia. I believe it's the second one. It's a Serbian man who killed them in Bosnia, and Serbia, they murdered him, and Russia came to support Serbia, but then France came against Russia. So it's all of these nations that were really close already, like Serbia and Russia, because of the Slavic influence. They supported each other during World War I, but then France and then Britain became involved, and it's like this chain reaction of friendships and relationships that really led to World War I, because countries didn't want to disown their other friend countries, I guess is a nice way of putting it. Like, if anyone here is taking a push or has taken a push, the United States and France, we owe a lot to France. France was pretty much our ally through everything with Britain, and France was supporting us with money, supporting us with power. So it's kind of like that. If we went into a war, France would most likely support us, and we would most likely support France. Nationalism is the idea of patriotism. Exactly what you said. It's patriotism on overkill. Nationalism is this new ideology because a lot of nations are becoming independent at this time. We have nations like Prussia and Austria-Hungary, which are separated from larger empires for the first time, and they begin to have this really patriotic view towards their language and their culture and their customs. And they become so patriotic that they begin to fight against everyone who doesn't have the same culture as them. So that's essentially what that is. Imperialism. Imperialism is such a big topic in AP World, especially in these later years. Imperialism is owning, being part of a large empire. Usually imperial empires are in England. In Europe, we have England and France and Spain. They own other nations, usually on other continents, and they rule them. For example, Britain and India, it's an imperial relationship because Britain ruled over India until the 1940s. Again, England with South Africa. We have Spain with the majority of South America. We have Portugal with Brazil. It's major European powers that own other nations, usually on other continents. Yeah, France and Haiti is another big one at this time. Eventually, though, Haiti does gain their independence pretty early in the game before this war. And then our last one is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. As I mentioned before, he was a really important political figure. He was part of the royal family, and he was assassinated by a nationalist, really radical nationalist, when he was visiting people in Bosnia, and that caused a lot of issues, and people began these people supporting Serbia, people not supporting Serbia because this man was Serbian, countries coming to Serbia's aid, but other countries declaring war against Serbia. So that assassination led to all of the other four bullet points mentioned before. Yeah, essentially, imperialism is correlated to colonization. A little earlier, like the 1750s, 1450s to 1750s, Europe becomes really fixated on colonization, and it leads to them becoming major empires and starting this reign of imperialism that really doesn't end in a lot of nations until like the late 1900s. So if I'm going too fast, you can just tell me in the chat, or if you have any questions yet, because I feel like I'm going a little quick. But why did the U.S. enter the war? So the U.S. didn't get involved in World War I immediately. It was kind of just Serbia and Russia and France for a while. But the U.S. entered the war eventually for two major reasons. And the first one was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. So around the same time as the Titanic, it's a little later than the Titanic, but it was this boat that was off the coast of Ireland, and it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. So a U-boat is essentially just a submarine. The Germans developed pretty amazing submarines at this time, and they would go into the oceans and just sink the boats of other nations that they weren't particularly fond of. And because of this, over 1,000, a little less than 1,200 people lose their lives. And before this, a lot of nations supported Germany in the war. And it's not because they were evil people. It's because at this time, Germany was a major European superpower. Germany was up there. Germany had a lot of land area. The German Empire, the Weimar Republic was humongous, had a lot of area in like present day Central European nations like Poland and Hungary. So Germany was really respected. And then they sunk a boat with almost 1,200 people on it, and so many people died that other nations began to turn their backs against Germany and think of them in a negative light. And the other one, as Dan mentioned, is the Zimmermann telegram. And I feel like this isn't talked about too much. The Zimmermann telegram is a bit odd. So it was a secret telegram that Germany sent, and Germany wanted to be in a military alliance with Mexico. And essentially an alliance was they wanted to be friends. They wanted Mexico to support Germany. In this telegram as well, Germany promised Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico, which had already become U.S. states. So it's a bit odd. And it was coded in this really cryptic kind of form, and it was decoded by the British in a place called Room 40, which is essentially like their secret service at the time during World War I. So they were trying to start an alliance with Mexico, and it was incredibly unsuccessful. Mexico was not willing to be in a military alliance with Germany, and it was kind of impossible for Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to become part of Mexico, especially when Texas was already a U.S. state. So that was a major cause of World War I, United States involvement in World War I, because the United States was like, you can't just promise states that are rightfully ours to another nation. And since when is it ethical to ask another nation to be friends with you without telling any other nation and doing it in a cryptic format? It almost seems kind of suspicious. So the effects of World War I. World War I was known as the Great War. And the Great War, because the world had never seen a war like this on this grand of a scale. Not a war so international, a war with such a large amount of death and weaponry, advanced weaponry. So it was an incredibly dangerous, life-taking war. And one of the effects was the creation of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations was created so that something like this would have never happened again. It was essentially created because nations were like, we can't economically take this anymore. We can't take this anymore. We lost so many people. We're in debt because of war. We've made stupid decisions. We can't let another war on this scale or any scale happen again. So it was the predecessor to the United Nations, which we have in place today. But the League of Nations was incredibly unsuccessful. So why was it unsuccessful? So major reason, is that the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. And because the U.S. was one of the major victors of World War I, other nations saw that the U.S. didn't join, and they're like, if the U.S. isn't joining, and they're like the major superpower now because they beat the old superpower Germany, then why should we join? Why should we deal with this if the nation that is like the strongest at this point doesn't want to join? So they were just following in the United States' footsteps. It really wasn't effective at all. And then Russia, which was the Soviet Union at this point, joined really late. Like a lot of nations joined right as it was created, right after the war. But Russia didn't join until much later. And then the League of Nations was created to solve international disputes, but then Russia invaded Finland, which completely went against everything that the League of Nations stand for. And they began a war in Finland called the Winter War because Finland was occupied by the Soviets, even though they were completely neutral in World War I. So they were looked down upon for that, for just completely going against the League of Nations Code of Conduct. And that's why the League of Nations was left unsuccessful. And that's why after World War II, we have the creation of the United Nations. Yeah, we couldn't really stop World War II. It was just a hope. That's what I like to think of Genesis. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. But it was a hope that we could never do that. But in some ways, you could see World War II as kind of inevitable. We put the Treaty of Versailles, which is what ended World War I, and it required Germany to pay such high amounts of money for the destruction that they caused that they went into economic recession. And the whole world went into economic recession after this. We have the Great Depression. And Wilson's 14 points was completely ignored. Wilson pretty much set up this entire League of Nations. He planned this. He received a Nobel Peace Prize, I think, for creating and planning out the League of Nations. And the United States didn't join. And then they completely ignored all the points he was trying to make about making the world more amicable. And then everything else just kind of didn't go so great. World War I caused World War II. I agree with you. So World War I just left the whole world with so much economic debt that it brought us into a depression. And the depression caused something called hyperinflation, which I'm going to go over later. And people were in such a desperate state that they elected some pretty radical governments. We have Russian communism, as you said before. We have the Russian Revolution, pretty much happens right after World War II. We have the Russian Revolution. The monarchy is assassinated, and Rasputins and the Bolsheviks come to power. And we have Nazism. We have the Nazis who come to power eventually in Germany because it's just such a desperate economic state. So there's definitely a lot of connections you can make between World War I causing World War II. There's definitely so many connections between the two events. So I kind of summarized some things from World War II already, but I think we'll go over it again. World War II was against the Allies and the Axis. So I want you guys to go into the chat and just name some nations that you know are part of the Allies and the Axis. For the Axis, there's like 3 major nations, but I think for the Allies, there's like 4 major nations in the Allies. Just put those in the comments. I want to see what you guys already know about World War II. Yeah, so the Axis is, I think, less complicated because the Axis doesn't really have that many as many countries involved in the Axis, other than like, the Axis was I saw a lot of people put this already, but it was Germany, Japan, and Italy. Of course, Germany was also and Italy were very heavily involved in imperialism at this point. Germany had a country that's now called Namibia, and Italy had countries in Eastern Africa around the Ethiopia, Eritrea region. So those nations as well, but they were still part of the Italian Empire. And in the Allies, I'm going to check what people, yeah, we have America, we have England, we have France, and we have the Soviet Union as well as part of the Allies. Another, similar to World War I, it's a very international war. It involves people on all different continents. And this one even more so because World War II heavily affects the United States, of course, North America as a whole, Europe, especially because most of the battles were fought in Europe. And also there was a lot of battles fought in Japan and Oceania, the Pacific Islands. There's a lot of nuclear testing on those islands. We have a lot of battles fought on those islands towards the end of the war against the Japanese. So Oceania is really heavily involved in this war, and it's something we don't really talk about as much. So we're going to definitely go over that. So it was from 1939 to 1945. So I mentioned this already, but if you think of the dates, World War I going from 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1949, what happened in the middle of that time period? Because it seems like a war, absolutely nothing, and another war. So what was the major event in between these two wars that kind of connected all three of them together? Because as I said, all of this is like a chain of events. Everything leads to something else. So I see you're putting comments already, and just maybe like one or two more people, and then I'll go over what the event is. I see someone already has it though, so that's really cool. Yeah, the Great Depression. The Great Depression was mainly okay. World War I ended in 1918. The 20s were known as the Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s. Sorry, it was a time of glamour, luxury, wealth. Of course, a little bit of corruption as well that came along with that. But the 20s were a time of increasing wealth for all over the world, not just the United States, but this is more focusing on the United States. And then people were doing extremely well. And even though the 20s came a lot of new social changes, women had more rights. Alcohol was banned in the entire nation, and it led to the bootlegging in this country that in turn led to a lot of corruption. Women gained the right to vote in 1920, as Dan said. Women's suffrage. The nation is completely changing during this period. It seems as if we are going from these Victorian kind of ways of thinking that we had in the early 1900s, then to World War I, and then we're going to the 20s and everything's completely changing. The nation's becoming more progressive. And then as Dan said, the stock market crashed. People lost their jobs. People lost pretty much everything. And this lasted for 10 years. And there were so many issues at this point, not just people losing their jobs, but there was the Dust Bowl. If anyone knows about the Dust Bowl, there was a lot. It was just not a good time for farmers in this country. There was a severe drought. Yeah, as Dan said, severe drought, heavy winds, cicada invasions. It was just not a great time environmentally, and it led to a mass exodus of people from the central part of this country, the Midwest, to move to California. And that's why one of the major reasons why California is so populated today is because so many people left because of the Dust Bowl. And then eventually the economic issues all go away. But then we get involved in World War II. So that's why the Great Depression is there as a reason why. As I said before, the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, it could have been successful, but it wasn't. It wasn't as successful as Wilson had hoped. The idea of appeasement. So with the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to pay large sums of money, was required to promise not to invade other nations, promise not to have a military that was so strong again, but because of the holes in the Treaty of Versailles and just the holes in the League of Nations and everything that happened after World War I, it's just nothing followed through. And yeah, as Jeremiah said, Germany really just didn't care. And none of this went through. All the stuff that the Allies had stated that they wanted, it just didn't go through as they had planned exactly. The rise of militarism in Germany and Japan. So I'm going to go into more depth with this later, but just a brief, I already went over this before, but just brief. People were in such a dire economic situation that they were looking for anything new that could give them money. And it's not Germany and Japan's fault for having such radical leaders, such like radical and terrible leaders as they did during this time. It's because they were looking for something new. It's because they wanted to be prosperous like they were in the 1920s. They wanted to have the military again and live like it was before World War I, which is why Germany was like, they saw Adolf Hitler and saw this could be a change for our country. And as you probably know, it wasn't the best change for either Germany or Japan. But it's not their fault for having such radical leaders elected during this time. It was just out of desperation for money and desperation for a better life for people in both nations. And then the traditional cause for World War II, it's the invasion of Poland. So I'm going to go into that a little bit later. But this is pretty much the event that causes it all. It's like the last straw before everything in Europe just completely changes. Germany and the Soviet Union eventually invade Poland, and that leads to World War II in 1939. So the causes, I went over the causes very briefly, but we'll go into more depth about this. So I'm gonna read comments because I see there's a few paragraphs. Chamberlain's appeasement of Czechoslovakia shows Britain really didn't want any conflict with Germany. Yes. At this point, no one really wanted more conflict with Germany. They just saw all these issues that happened and thought there was no point in creating any more conflict because it would affect people's lives, it would affect the economy. And there was just no point of causing any more issues. And then no one else really wanted to bother Germany because they had a strong military. The Treaty of Versailles stated that Germany just had limits on their military, but those really weren't followed. So Germany did have an extremely strong military at the time and afterwards. So I agree with both of your comments. So I really appreciate the comments. I think they're really great to see everyone's perspective on different historical issues. And this has been really cool with your stream because everyone seems like they're giving their opinion about something, which is kind of awesome. So causes, we have hyperinflation. So before, we know Germany before this time as the German Republic. But eventually, Germany becomes known as the Weimar Republic under a new leader around this time period, a little earlier. And there's something called hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is money becomes worthless, absolutely worthless, because there's just so much of it. And because of this, people are struggling to survive. They have so much money that you need in this case, Germany had such a terrible case of hyperinflation that you needed billions and billions of dollars to buy something like so tiny, and money just became worthless to have. And as you can see in the first picture, people are using money as wallpaper because it's not important. It's cheaper than using brick or paper to line your walls because money has no value anymore. And this is because of World War One. World War One, we owed so much money. Germany owed so much money that the money just became worthless because they were in debt. Children in the second picture playing with different stacks of money, and you can't imagine that today because we're not in inflation right now. Nothing's really that inflated right now. But it becomes such a desperate need. It becomes so desperate that people just, money has no worth anymore. They give it obviously to kids and to play and stack and create things with. Do any of you guys know any other examples of hyperinflation? So there's two other examples I can think of, but they're later than this. They would be in the 50s. One of them was in the 50s, also in Europe. If anyone knows this, this might be more of an AP European history question because it's just so specific. But if any, it would be 1956, I believe, around that time period, because in 1956, there's a lot of economic issues in Central Europe going on with Soviet puppet states, Soviet influence in Central Europe. So I'll give you a hint. It's a Central European nation. If anyone knows what other country had a really big issue with hyperinflation, I think it's the worst ever recorded incidence of hyperinflation in world history. So if any of you guys know that, you should drop it in the comments. I'd really want to see. And then there was an example of hyperinflation about 3 years ago in an African nation called Zimbabwe, and they had a pretty terrible deal with hyperinflation as well. They started producing like $1 trillion bills because it was just everything was just so incredibly expensive. The other country was Hungary, as you know and put it. Hungary was really influenced by the Soviets in the 50s, as were most countries in Central Europe. And during the 1950s, late 1950s, 1956, there was a revolution in Hungary that led to hyperinflation, and it was so much worse than Germany's, but it was still an issue. And Hungary didn't really recover from that until much later in world history. So it's really interesting to see how hyperinflation can really affect a nation's economy. The Nazi regime. So what do you guys know about the Nazi regime? If you guys can just leave that in the comments. Anything you know, like major people who were part of the Nazi party, any major historical events that you might know about, things that were done by the Nazi, major historical events, anything that they may have done. Yeah, they were really hyper-nationalists. They were obsessed with the idea of Germany and German people being supreme, and that Aryans were supreme. They were born better than everyone else. They were I cannot speak today. They were against Jewish people. The Nazi regime was really against almost anyone that didn't fall into the status quo, so to say. They did kill Jewish people, but we're going to go on later and look at the other ethnic groups, people of other religions, people with other backgrounds and stories that they also discriminated against, because it's a long list and it's really unfortunate. The Aryan race was the perfect race. They believed that people who were Aryan, so people of European descent, not just people of European descent. Hitler was mainly focused on people with blonde hair and blue eyes. That was his what he said was like the sign of pure Aryanness, if that's a word. He believed that people with blonde hair and blue eyes were perfect. They were genetically perfect. Hitler Youth. This is most likely a picture of Hitler Youth, even though there's some older people, but the people in the front are most likely members of Hitler Youth. But it's also, as Hannah said, really ironic because Hitler didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes, but he believed that people with blonde hair and blue eyes were supreme. I don't know. It is incredibly ironic. And it's something we'll go over later. And if you look at Nazi propaganda posters, all of the people have blonde hair and blue eyes because he was just trying to show people that people with blonde hair and blue eyes were genetically perfect. And one of the major reasons why he said blonde hair and blue eyes was because the Scandinavians, blonde hair and blue eyes, he believed they were genetically perfect. And this was a taunt towards the Polish. Now, there are Polish people with blonde hair and blue eyes, but Hitler would Polish people, in Hitler's point of view, most of them had like darker hair like I did, brown eyes, even though many of them did have blonde hair and blue eyes. So it was just the Germans at this time, Nazi Germans, weren't really fond of Poland that much. So it was somewhat of an attack towards Poland. The invasion of Poland. Okay, so Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, and then they invaded the part that bordered Germany. So that'd be the western part of Poland. They invade the western part of Poland, and then the Soviet Union invades the eastern part of Poland. And then they divide the nation. So one side would be German, one part would be Soviet, under something called the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. So basically, I split this part, I take this part, and we won't fight over it. Is essentially what it is. And then Poland was officially part of the Nazi regime, Nazi rule. So why did the US enter the war? There's one major reason why the US entered the war, and it's something that we focus a lot more in US history than world history. And yeah, Hannah, it's Pearl Harbor. So this was the bombing of a military station in Hawaii. Many lives lost. The island that it was situated on was destroyed. It was fiery. It was incredibly deadly. And the United States tried to remain neutral during this war, especially because of what had happened during World War I. They just didn't want to get involved in any more conflict. But after this war, this event, the United States is really just not happy with the Axis powers, and particularly Japan. So they get involved in the war because they had destroyed just so much because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So effects of World War II. There's a lot of effects of World War II, most of them being negative. One of the major ones, not as much an effect, but an effect of the Nazi regime, an effect of the anti-Semitism that was going on in Germany, was the Holocaust. And I believe that's my first one. So the Holocaust, it's also known as the Shoah. It's the persecution and genocide of European minorities. So it's mainly Jewish people. It was about 6 million Jewish victims, but about 11 million others. And the majority of these others were Spanish Republicans, the disabled, people of African descent that were in Germany, because Germany had a lot of territories in Africa during this time, Romanis. It was a lot of other people that were put into concentration camps along with Jewish people. And they all had stars that would represent. It was almost a badge of shame. Like if anyone has ever read The Scarlet Letter, it's almost the same as Pearl's Scarlet Letter. It's a sign of shame so that people can look at you and think of you below what they are. So many people know the Jewish people had to wear yellow stars, and Romani people, I believe, had to wear brown. And then Asocials. Asocials is the term that they coined. It was basically anyone that they believe didn't fit into the status quo. Even Freemasons wore black stars, and then there was a whole rainbow of different color stars that people had to wear during this time because Germany just became so fixated on creating this perfect Aryan race with no one with issues. So we have two major ideas coming from Nazi Germany at this time. We have anti-Semitism, which is hatred towards Jews, Jewish people, and anti-Zionism, which is hatred towards Romani people. So Romani people were not particularly liked by Hitler. Romani, they are also known as gypsies. It's almost a kind of derogatory term. So they prefer to be called Romani. And the main reason why Hitler didn't like them is because they had darker skin. They had darker hair. Their hair had texture. It was curlier or wavier. They lived nomadic lifestyles. They didn't live in sedentary housing. They kind of traveled in their wagons. They didn't dress like German people did. Some of them spoke the Romani language. Some of them spoke German. He just didn't like them because of how different they were from the German people. And this led to increased anti-Zionism as well as anti-Semitism in Germany. Many of these people were put into concentration camps, and they were liberated after World War II, and a number of Jewish people that had survived the Holocaust immigrated to Israel, which was newly formed as a Jewish safe haven after World War II. The Pacific Islands left in ruin. The United States did a lot of testing, nuclear testing, in islands in the Pacific because they were inhabited but sparsely inhabited. So they believed that it was the perfect spot to test their new nuclear bombs. And also a lot of battles were fought there between Japan because of how close it was to Japan. It was just more efficient for the Japanese people, and they were relatively close to Hawaii as well. So the Pacific Islands were left completely in ruin as a result of atomic bombs, as a result of just general war there. The Pacific Islands were left in complete ruin, a lot of them, and it was really difficult for them to recover. So the only battles I remember there are Okinawa and Midway. Yeah, so Okinawa is one of the major ones. Okinawa is modern day Japan. And Midway is an island I think is just called Midway. It's a U.S. territory. It's not populated, thankfully, but yeah. There's another one called Guadalcanal or Guadalcanal. It's in, I believe, modern day Solomon Islands. People lived there. They tested atomic bombs there, I believe. So, and then there was another battle called the Battle of Tarawa. So one of the terrible things about the Battle of Tarawa is that Tarawa is the capital city of a modern day nation. It's a nation called Kiribati, but it's spelled like Kiribati. And they had a battle in a capital city of a nation. It was, so it led to a lot of warfare, and it was an isolated island as well, but people lived there, and people tested atomic bombs. Bikini Atoll, which is where we get, oddly enough, Bikini Bottom from SpongeBob. Bikini Atoll is where we tested the atomic bombs that we later used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So these islands are completely obliterated by nuclear bombs and other battles that took place there. So yeah, they weren't especially great for those islands. Iwo Jima is another major one. It was U.S. victory, but luckily no people live on Iwo Jima, so it was okay. It wasn't exactly okay, but it didn't really affect people as much because people didn't live there. And then that gets me to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We had a plane that flew there called the Enola Gay, and they flew over Japan, and they dropped bombs. They dropped atomic bombs. So we have something during this time called the Manhattan Project, which I didn't mention before. And the Manhattan Project was basically people trying to design the first nuclear bomb. And they successfully did it, and they did it in Japan. I'm not entirely sure which one it was, Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but one of the bombings was an accident. It was supposed to be on another island or another part of Japan that had a significantly lower population. And the winds had changed the course of the atomic bomb so that it landed in Nagasaki instead of another part of Japan with a significantly lower population. So one of these was an accident. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe Nagasaki. But Nagasaki and Hiroshima were decently large cities. Like Nagasaki now has about 500,000 people living there still. And one of the major issues with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was our first atomic bomb. We didn't know the effects that the atomic bomb would have on the human body. And people there were severely burned. A lot of people died, were almost essentially cremated when the bomb hit their cities. The mushroom clouds and all the uranium had just completely obliterated all of their bodies. And what was I going to say? The 1950s. The 1950s, it's about 5 to 10 years after the end of World War II. A lot of people in these cities are diagnosed with leukemia, which is cancer of the blood. They realize that a lot of people in these two places are being diagnosed with cancer of the blood. And they're trying to make the connection between how did all these people get it? Is it something in the food? Is it a result of modernization or something? But it was really because of the uranium and all the elements, all the really just high radioactive elements that were in the atomic bomb that they had been exposed to for so many years. And it led to large amounts of cancer in both of these towns as a result. There's a really good book. This is incredibly random, but it's about a Japanese girl who was born like when she was like, I don't know if she was born during the war or after the war, but she was about 10 years old, and it's like the 1950s, and she was diagnosed with leukemia as a result of the bomb being dropped. And it's her making 1,000 paper cranes as like a hope for her to get better. It's a really good book. I read it in school when I was young, and it's a historical fiction, but an entertaining historical fiction. So if you guys want to read that book, I think it's really good for AP World because it just gives you the perspective of someone who had to deal with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and live as a result of it, because that's not what people hear about with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They don't hear about the effects of it. Yeah, it's something with 1,000 paper cranes. It's something and 1,000 paper cranes if anyone wants to look it up and read it at some point. And that's the end of my slide presentation. So if anyone has any questions or any comments, yeah, Sadako and the 1,000 Paper Cranes. I read that book in about 4th grade or maybe 5th grade, and it's just such a sad book. And it's based on a real story because it starts with this little blurb from the author that was like, this is based on the real life of Sadako, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, she loved track and field. And it's like, it's really sad to see because the United States never used atomic bombs after this, after seeing just the effects of it on the human body. And it was just, even though Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and didn't do entirely the most ethical things during World War II, it wasn't justified. It wasn't entirely moral for Truman to agree to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is also another book from this time, about this time. It's a kid named Bruno, and I forget the other kid's name, but it's the son of a Nazi officer, and he lives near a concentration camp, and he kind of communicates with this Jewish boy who lives in the concentration camp between the barbed wire walls. And that's also a very good book. And it gives some historical context into this time as well from a German perspective. This would be the perspective of Japan, but from someone who believed that Japan was not correct in their thinking, and then the United States wasn't correct in their thinking. Anyone have any questions about anything? Anything World War I, World War II, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anything that I mentioned in the slides, anything that I didn't mention in the slides, anything that you want me to go back to? Honestly, anything. It's like an open question and answer thing right now. So yeah, it's definitely, as I said before, something that really connects. It's almost sad to see because we have good times and low times and good times and low times, and it's almost like this, it's going up and down. Nothing's really stable, or nothing's really increasing. So the 1900s were a pretty decent time economically. It's the United States is very conservative. They really highlight what can I say? They really highlight Victorian ideals. And then we get into World War I, and people have the first recorded instances of PTSD, or what they called at the time was shell shock. And then 1920s, we're prosperous again, but then we have the Great Depression. And then we get okay again, and then we're in World War II. And then the 50s, everything starts improving, thankfully. But can you go over the annexation of Germany and Soviet Union? Yeah, of course. That was a little earlier. Did I pass it? Yes, okay. So it started with Germany, September 1st, 1939. Germany borders Poland to the west. Yes, Germany borders Poland to the west. And here's Poland. This is my demonstration of Poland. So over here would be Germany, right? And Russia is one very large country, but it also has like this one little speck in the middle of nowhere that doesn't border Russia. And it borders Poland, and it's called Kaliningrad or Kaliningrad. Forgive me for my Russian pronunciation, but I'm going to say Kaliningrad. So initially Germany invaded Poland from here, takes this part of Poland, and they go through a city called Danzig, which I believe has a new name now. Like Danzig was the German name, but Gdansk, or it has a new Polish name as of now. And then Germany has this part of Poland. They completely took it over, not exactly colonized it because it's not imperialism, but they tried to get it under the sphere of Nazi influence. Nazis were trying to expand their ideals to other parts of Europe because that's what Hitler wanted to do. Hitler wanted to create a completely Aryan society, and the first thing that he could do to do that was invade Poland. And Germany was very against the people of Poland. If you look up Nazi Germany-Poland relations, like Germany made a lot of jokes about Poland being stupid and backwards and not Aryan, even though they are in Europe, and commenting on how they had black hair or brown hair and they weren't like ethnically European enough. So they invaded Poland. They thought that that was the first best place to go. There aren't very many options, honestly. There's like, you have France, you have Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia eventually does get invaded by Germany a little later than this, but France also gets invaded by Germany in the 40s, not in the 30s. But I believe Czechoslovakia might have been invaded like right after this. So, and then the Soviet Union decides to take the other side of Poland. And this is almost kind of odd, and because Germany and the Soviet Union are essentially doing the same exact thing. They're invading a country. They're going against everything that was stated in the League of Nations. But Germany is Axis, and the Soviet Union is an ally state. And the Soviet Union essentially just joins the Allies because they knew that the Allies were going to win and they wanted the support from the United States, even though Soviet leaders and Soviet ideology essentially supported Nazi ideology more than American or French beliefs, because Russia had this idea of Russification at this time, which was the idea that everyone should be Russian, speak Russian, look Russian, dress Russian, eat Russian, um, essentially assimilate to Russian culture. Sovietization is also a major thing during this time. People should live like the average Soviet person. They should support the Soviet government. So Germany and the Soviet Union had similar ideals, but Germany was an Axis and the Soviet Union supported the Allies, which is kind of odd, to be honest. And then Poland is divided in half. Part of it goes to the Germans and part of it goes to the Soviets. For not the remainder of the war, but for a majority of the war. And Germany eventually gets divided as well. It's a little later. This is like the 50s, but Poland gets divided into two different regions. We have Western Germany and East Germany. And West Germany is not exactly invaded, but it has influence. The United States, France, and Britain own different sections of West Germany. And then East Germany was under Soviet influence. So Germany was divided with the Berlin Wall through the middle after World War II. This is immediately following after World War II. Germany splits into two different sections, one that is Allies and one that is the Soviets, like this. And this is the what's it called? The Berlin Wall. And this Berlin Wall doesn't get separated. The Germany doesn't combine into one until maybe the late 80s, early 90s. Like I would say 1989, 1990. Like that's how late. So Germany remained a split country with communism on one side and democracy on one side, capitalism more per se, but for a while. So that's the invasion of Poland, plus a little bit extra about Germany and the Soviet Union at the end. If anyone has any other questions, feel free. I heard a majority of Germans didn't agree with Hitler, believed he was too radical. Is that right? I cannot give you an exact answer on this, but I know some Germans did not agree with Hitler. They initially voted for Hitler because they thought he was a breath of fresh air. Like he could change the economy. He could better this nation because it is just in such an economic disarray. And they supported him at the very beginning, but eventually this completely changed. And don't feel sorry for asking because I'm using my historical knowledge. Because what I'm thinking, there's something called Kristallnacht, and it's basically a bunch of Germans and Nazi supporters and German Nazi supporters. They break into to Jewish-owned businesses. They take hammers and sledgehammers and they just knock all the glass windows and they set things on fire. And it's also known as the Night of Broken Glass. It's just they break into synagogues and it's just a mess. So I would believe that most Germans would not agree with that part. But when you live under such a radical government for such a long time, you almost become brainwashed to believe in what the person is saying. And if you don't become brainwashed and you believe that what they're doing is morally incorrect, you can't speak out against it because you could be persecuted yourself. Hitler and the Nazi government could find you as an asocial, could make you work and make you be sent to concentration camps, because it wasn't just Jews, it was anyone that didn't fit Hitler's status quo, anyone that spoke out against him, anyone that was a Romani, anyone who was disabled as well, could be sent to concentration camps or punished or imprisoned. This is incredibly random, but I had to do a project in like 8th grade about the Holocaust. And German reactions towards Hitler's rule. And we got assigned child survivors of the Holocaust to research. So I did not get a Jewish girl. I got a girl who was a Jehovah's Witness. And she was from Germany. And she was what Hitler described. Blonde hair, blue eyes. I believe her name is like Giselle Gottfried or Gisela Gottfried, if you want to look her up. She was what Hitler thought of as an Aryan, like as what he believed was the perfect German. Her mom was a Jehovah's Witness. So, but I don't believe she was a Jehovah's Witness. I just believe the mom was a Jehovah's Witness. So what they did was they took the mother in the middle of the night and they beheaded her with a guillotine. And she received a letter from the prison that executed her, like, oh, your mom's dead, you're never going to see her again. But she never got to say goodbye to her mom. And that was just something that's really stayed with me, especially studying AP World for so long, also studying world history. This was about seventh grade. This is about seventh grade when I read about this girl. So it's definitely left an impact on me as well. But if anyone doesn't have any other questions, we can. I wonder, what if a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person was Jewish? I don't really know. I'm sure he would weigh the Jewish part more. Like, he would just be like, blonde hair, blue eyes, but oh, you're Jewish. And they would most likely be sent to concentration camps as well, which we all know were just incredibly horrible. And people were worked to death. And it wasn't until all the concentration camps were liberated by Americans. I believe the first one was Auschwitz. They liberated Auschwitz with the Soviets. It was the Americans and the Soviets who liberated Auschwitz. Yeah. If anyone has any other questions, you can ask. If not, I'm going to end the stream. But feel free if you have any other questions to ask about anything. World War I, World War II, Great Depression, just any questions that are on your mind. Because this is a time of just a lot of things going on. It can get really, really confusing just of how much is going on and all this stuff that's changing in Europe, because it's a massive change from, especially for Germany. Germany going through all of these wars where they're just completely unsuccessful. But then the US, because of World War I and because of World War II, they become superpowers. The US becomes the world superpower as a result of both of these wars. So I see no one else has questions. So I'm going to end the broadcast. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you found it interesting, or it's going to help you with AP World. I know the AP World test is like less than 3 months. So in case you guys don't watch any more of my streams, I want to wish all of you individually good luck on the AP exam, even though it seems like it's that far away. It's not really that far away. I hope all of you do well and amazing. And thank you so much for staying through this and being such an awesome audience. And thank you so much. Thank you guys so much.